All right, hi. So we've had a little bit of a technical difficulty in the audio, but I guess you all can hear me. So I'm going to introduce myself. My name's Professor Geoff Wawro, and I'm at the University of North Texas in Denton, where I direct the Military History Center. And the National Museum of World War II in the Pacific has asked me to give a sort of a keynote overview of the war in the Pacific, to kind of set the stage for the talks that are to come. So I want to talk just generally about the growth of Japan, the rise of Japan, the threats posed to the United States by Japan, and then get into an overview of the Second World War in the Pacific and how the U.S. dealt with it. So the background is obviously that Japan, after the Meiji Restoration of 1868, was a young great power in a hurry. They adopted a lot of the Western models for growth. They brought in British naval advisors to upgrade their navy. They brought in first French and then German military advisors to improve the Japanese army and transition it from kind of a medieval samurai army to a modern 19th and 20th century army. And of course, then the Japanese industrialized quickly using these big conglomerates called zaibatsu. And then this empowered Japan then fought a war with China between 1893 and 1895. The Japanese, to everyone's surprise, won the war, and they annexed Taiwan, and they annexed Korea. And then in 1905, Japan fought a war with Russia, and again, to everyone's surprise, they won, gaining primacy in northern China and Manchuria, annexing a big portion of it, and then securing control of Korea, which the Russians had been contesting. And so we arrive at World War II, and we see a world in which Britain is the most populous country in the world. The British Empire controls a quarter of the world's population, 550 million people. But there are these big continent-sized great powers and empires like Britain, like the United States being the richest of the great powers with a GDP of $1 trillion a year and a population of 150 million. The Soviet Union with its population of 170 million. France plus its colonies with a population of 115 million. So the Japanese look very warily at this structure of power. Their population just 71 million. Their GDP, less than a quarter of the United States GDP. So the Japanese have a recipe for growth, a recipe to be able to rise to the status of, say, the British Empire by pushing into their own natural hinterland, as they see it, which is China. So Japan, with its population of 71 million, adds the population of Manchuria in the 1930s, 50 million more, adds in the population of Korea, 24 million more, adds in the population of Taiwan, 7 million more, brings the Japanese population to 150 million, much the same as the US. You add China to that number, which Japan is aiming to do with its population of 270 million, and suddenly you're talking about a Japanese empire with a population of north of 400 million people. And the Japanese GDP obviously would rise, proportionately. So Japan has these big, huge ambitions in the 1930s, but they feel blocked. Why? Because the US has been blocking Japanese growth in Japanese eyes since the 1890s, when the US annexes Hawaii in 1898, fights the Spanish-American War in 1898, adding the Philippines and Guam to its Far Eastern holdings. The US in 1899 publishes the Open Door Note, which basically makes China an open market to all the great powers and forbids the great powers to carve it into enclaves. And Japan disputes this. They think that they are the most proximate power to China, that they should have a predominant place there, and they resent this US demand for kind of even-handedness. And then, of course, the United States negotiates an end to the Russo-Japanese War in 1905 at Portsmouth, New Hampshire, peace conference led by President Teddy Roosevelt, when the U.S. sees to it that the Japanese get no Russian reparations, and they get half the territory in Manchuria that they had desired. So the Japanese see themselves as being contained by US pressure. And the Japanese interpret this not as kind of the, the natural ebb and flow of policy, but they see this as what they call moralistic aggression. The US is moralizing in Eastern questions. And they're trying to use this idea of Chinese sovereignty and national self-determination of the Asian peoples as a way to keep Japan down. So this is the background to Japan's decision to invite war with the great powers in World War II, to push into China and damn the consequences in 1937, and then to the mad gamble of Pearl Harbor in 1941. Now, the gamble of Pearl Harbor, which was that, Japan risked a war of attrition with the much richer, more populous, more powerful United States. That gamble was based on the calculation that, no great power had ever fought an oceanic war as vast and as complicated as World War II in the Pacific. And we must say that American victory in the Pacific in World War II was utterly remarkable and is still remarkable in retrospect. First, we need to talk a little bit about the production miracle that made possible America's victory in the Pacific and in Europe on these two massive fronts in World War II. Between 1939 and 1944, when US industrial output reached its wartime peak, American GDP rose 55%. And the military share of that spending as a percentage of GDP rose from 1.4% in 1939 to 45% in 1944. Now, whereas Japan spent about 80% of its GDP on defense in World War II and had to subject its economy to starvation measures in order to go along. People were literally living on small rations of rice. The US afforded this massive military buildup and the standard of living, despite the fact that we stopped building cars and put those resources into tanks and planes, the standard of living in the United States actually rose despite the massive military outlays during the war. In all, the US spent about $300 billion on World War II, which works out to about $4 trillion today. And much more if you were to make it as a share as a percentage of GDP. But in inflation-adjusted terms, what we spent fighting in World War II was 8 times the cost of the New Deal, 9 times the cost of the Korean War, 5 times the cost of the Vietnam War. And the prodigies of industrial output were just amazing. During World War II, the US produced 11 times as much coal as Japan, 222 times as much oil as Japan, 13 times as much steel as Japan, and 40 times as much artillery shells as Japan. In the first year of the war, the US takes a capital ship loss of 40%. The Japanese lose 30% of their capital ships. And yet the US quickly makes up those losses and begins to expand. The Japanese, in the entire course of World War II, never even make up that initial 30% loss of ships. US naval appropriations in 1940 alone exceeded the entire previous 10 years of Japanese naval construction. In 1943, only 3 aircraft carriers were under construction in Japanese yards, while 22 carriers were being built in the United States. Japanese aircraft production in the war was only 20% of America's. During 1942, the US built 50,000 planes, the Japanese just 9,000. Over the course of the war, the US builds 325,000 combat airplanes, the Japanese just 75,000. As early as 1943, with only 15% of US resources dedicated to the war in the Pacific, America was already able to turn the tide of the war with Japan. Still, economic primacy does not alone determine the outcome. Hard fighting did. Yamamoto had argued for the Pearl Harbor attack, as he put it, so that the morale of the US Navy and the morale of the American people plunges to such an extent after Pearl Harbor that it can't be recovered. Admiral Yamamoto had argued that Japan would not need to win on the battlefield. Japan would win, Yamamoto argued, by a surrender in the White House, in Washington itself, as he put it, where the politicians of the day lacked the willingness to make sacrifices. So just as the Japanese assumed that they would never conquer the United States, they assumed that the United States, which would be exhausted by fighting in Europe and North Africa and the long march across the Pacific, so similar to Russia's plight in 1905 during the Russo-Japanese War, they assumed that the US would never conquer Japan, but instead would give up and negotiate instead. So among the many Axis strategic miscalculations in World War II, these were among the worst. But only in retrospect. At the time, the Japanese gamble appeared to have pretty good chances of success. Because the US war against Japan in the Pacific stands out as the most unusual, among the most unusual wars in history, in the sense that its problems of distance and supply and the peculiar nature of its main battlefield, which was the Pacific Ocean, were beyond comparison with any other conflict, including the one with Germany. In retrospect, we often think that Japan, stood little chance in the war, but that would be to ignore the considerable advantages that Tokyo enjoyed at the outset. It's fair to say that only the industrialized, technological American way of war and US democracy, which did not fold in the face of Japanese bluster as the Japanese had intended, could have overwhelmed those advantages. Initially, Japan made maximal use of its strong position and Western weakness. The main and secondary Japanese bases in home waters were invulnerable to air attack. Further forward, the Japanese had defied international prohibitions after World War I. In their mandates, the island groups like the Marshalls and the Marianas and the Gilberts that they inherited from the Germans after World War I. And they built a chain of naval and air bases in those island groups. Truk in the Carolines lay athwart the main US supply line to the Philippines. Rabaul in New Guinea blocked the main route to Australia. After their invasion of China in 1937, the Japanese raked in all of the Chinese ports. With Taiwan, they now commanded the US-ruled Philippines from three sides. In the second half of 1941, they encroached on French Indochina, pushing down into northern Vietnam and then southern Vietnam to take Cam Ranh Bay, which was a first-class anchorage just 750 miles from the Great British base at Singapore. Then they struck Pearl Harbor in December 1941, followed by the attack on the Philippines, Thailand, and the oil-rich islands of Borneo, Sumatra, and Java. Hong Kong was attacked and cut off. Thailand surrendered on December 9th, 1941. Hong Kong fell on Christmas Day. Manila surrendered on January 2nd. Singapore, the great bastion of British Malaya, fell in February 42. So Japan's early gains through April 1942, a 10,000 square mile resource base and empire that stretched from China to the mid-Pacific, from Alaska to Australia, it might have been invincible, but for the full-blooded application of the industrialized American way of war. The Japanese, for example, had developed fast, long-range, two-engine, land-based bombers in the 1930s, the Nell and the Betty, precisely for deployment on the islands of the Central and South Pacific, where they could be used along with the Val dive bomber and the Kate torpedo bomber in tandem with Japanese submarines to whittle away at the US Navy as it drove toward Japan. Before this war, we thought of bases as fixed installations on supply lines that connected industrial resources to military units in the field. In this war, with the vast Pacific Ocean spaces and the appalling expenditures of supplies, imagine one task force of a carrier, 3 cruisers, and 6 destroyers burned up 6,000 barrels of oil every day, and more than that when conducting flight operations. Well, so a new system had to be invented for a war like this. Unless the supply line was always full, nothing could be guaranteed at the operational end, or loaded fast enough at home to make up deficits. So in this war, fixed bases were supplemented with operational bases that offered a choice of movements in the campaign. Supplies could be pushed continually forward, so operating units in the field never ran out. The Japanese had planned on the US being pinned down by the Battle of the Atlantic and the worsening situation in Europe, where the Soviet Union seemed to be collapsing. Indeed, America's war plan DOG, elaborated in November 1940 and formalized in Rainbow 5 in 1941, called for a Germany-first strategy that would leave the Pacific theater under-equipped and on the defensive for at least a year. Yet from 1942 on, the US begins to recover in the Pacific. The Japanese mistakenly thought that it would be enough to secure every position that the Allies might potentially use as springboards to roll back Japan's early gains. Well, the appointment of 56-year-old Admiral Chester Nimitz to be commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor was arguably decisive in facilitating the US counterattack. One of the greatest naval commanders of all time, Nimitz absorbed the losses of Pearl Harbor virtually without comment and resolved not merely to defend, but to attack with what he had in January 1942, which was just 3 carriers, a handful of cruisers and destroyers, and a submarine fleet whose torpedoes often did not work. Nimitz's pugnacity, which contrasted with the caution of the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Ernest King, and the President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt, was all the more remarkable in view of Japanese strength. The force known as Kido Butai, which is Japanese for mobile force, which was essentially the Japanese way to apply Mahanian principles of fleet concentration to the dawning age of naval aviation. Whereas the Americans used carriers singly at the center of independent task forces, Yamamoto and his admirals put all their eggs in one basket. The force that attacked Pearl Harbor and would then attempt a war-winning blow at Midway comprised 6 large aircraft carriers and 2 fast battleships screened by a dozen cruisers and destroyers. What that meant was that the Japanese could put 412 aircraft aloft at any one time against the 60 to 90 that might be managed by a US task force. The Japanese, for example, had launched 350 aircraft for the attack on Pearl Harbor. Well, Nimitz's unexpected boldness after the shock of Pearl Harbor pushed the Japanese back into a defensive posture and converted their offensive strategy, unveiled in late 1941, to a defensive one. Initially poised to take Australia and even India, Japan was compelled to stand down by Nimitz's carrier task forces, which hit the Marshalls and the Gilberts in January of 1942, Rabaul in February, Wake in New Guinea in March. Nimitz was exploring new possibilities of naval, air, and oceanic warfare. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942 was the first naval battle in history in which a decision was reached by carrier-borne air without any ships exchanging salvos. The risks of that battle were tremendous. The Coral Sea was 3,500 miles from Hawaii and 600 miles from the nearest source of fuel oil, leaving the American flat tops there totally dependent on their fleet oilers. A tactical win for Japan, the Coral Sea was a strategic one for the United States, in that the Americans could easily make good the loss of the Lexington, whereas the Japanese could not replace all of the planes, 105, and all of the experienced pilots that they lost in the battle, as well as a light carrier. Well, Midway, in June of 1942, was the decisive victory of the war in the Pacific, comparable in scope to Trafalgar or Tsushima, attempting to lure 3 U.S. carriers that had escaped the attack on Pearl Harbor into battle. The Japanese were roundly beaten. Against the loss of 1 carrier and 150 aircraft, the U.S. Navy destroyed 4 Japanese carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, 275 aircraft, and 4,000 men and officers, including some of the Navy's most experienced cadres. Midway, which was occasioned by code breaking, but also by Nimitz's decisive, prompt, shrewd countermoves and his willingness to stand against pressure from Washington, stole the initiative from Japan once and for all. Yamamoto knew before the battle that America had 11 big carriers under construction, all of which would become operational in 1943. Japan at the time had only 1 carrier under construction, and it wouldn't be ready until 1944. After Midway, Japan no longer commanded the sea and never would again. Also, their fleet, still strong, was fatally unbalanced. After this, Japan would only cling to its defensive perimeter, hoping that it could wear down the U.S. Navy as it advanced into the heart of the watery Japanese Empire. At Guadalcanal in November 1942, Nimitz's strategy of island hopping took shape. With the Japanese reluctant to surrender or evacuate, Nimitz grasped at the real road to Tokyo. And the real road to the heart of the Japanese Empire lay over the sea alone and not via the defended perimeter. Looking at his maps and charts, Nimitz grasped that Japan's 14,200-mile ocean perimeter from Burma to the Aleutians simply could not be defended. As the Navy recovered, nowhere did the Japanese even enjoy even local command of the sea. The sprawling Japanese garrisons in hundreds of islands, their bases and airfields and forts and anchorages, and even citadels like Truk and Rabaul, said to be impregnable, did not mean anything. 10,000 Japanese troops here, 7,000 Japanese troops there. In most cases, they were of no account and were not worth the expenditure of a single Marine company. You just bypassed them and you pressed ahead. And when you reached Japan, all of those amputated fragments of Japanese power would fall into your hands without a fight. In the course of the war, the U.S. Navy, Marines, and Army bypassed places like Truk, Yap, Rabaul, Wewak in New Guinea, Java, and Taiwan, all of which were crammed with Japanese forces that were useless because they couldn't move. But to do this, Nimitz needed command of the sea and a few advanced bases to use as stepping stones. By the fall of 1943, the U.S. had a dozen new Essex-class carriers operating in the Pacific, and the island hopping campaign began in earnest. In November 1943, the Navy took Macon and Tarawa and the Gilberts. General MacArthur began his drive to the Philippines, island hopping on his own, and leaving huge Japanese garrisons in Western New Guinea behind. The Japanese could only watch from the sidelines. Trying to rebuild their carrier strength, they found themselves strategically immobile. They found they could only cling to the islands. But even clinging to the islands was getting impossible because Nimitz twinned this Central Pacific drive with a submarine assault on the Japanese merchant fleet. Using submarines out of Pearl Harbor, he began to hit Japan's critical supply lines in its eastern and western resource areas, as well as the ones right off the coast of Japan. The Allied Submarine War hit New Guinea, the Malacca Straits, the Dutch East Indies, Indochina, and the coast of Burma. In total, 8 million tons of Japanese shipping were lost in combat in World War II, of which 5 million tons were destroyed by Allied submarines. The Japanese were totally unprepared for submarine warfare. Their obsolete naval doctrine still maintained that submarines were useful only in cooperation with surface forces in hostile areas. My Marco Rubio moment. By early 1944, Japanese losses far exceeded output, and the Japanese were unable to take in the vast resources of that empire they had conquered in 1941-42. They couldn't get any of the rice from Thailand, the rubber from Vietnam, coal or bauxite from China. Those commodities were now impossible to move. Of the 19 million tons of oil produced in the Japanese occupied territories, chiefly the Dutch East Indies, today's Indonesia, only a quarter of it ever made it to Japan. The rest was sunk by submarines. Some relief was had only in the steady contraction of the Japanese empire under Allied attacks, which reduced demand for stuff, but also reduced Japanese power. By 1944, the Japanese were reduced to trying to make bunker oil and aviation fuel from Taiwanese sugar or Manchurian cereals. So fully had shipping collapsed in the face of US submarine warfare and land-based air patrols. And as for the 2 million Japanese combat troops in China during the war, which was, after all, 4/5 of the Japanese Army's active duty strength, with Allied command of the air and the sea, it didn't matter how many Japanese divisions were in China, because by 1944, none of them could be moved anywhere else. So as the war began to converge on the Japanese home islands, all of that armed strength in China was very difficult to move back for the defense of Japan. By early 1944, the US carrier advantage in the Pacific was crushing, and US battleships increasingly fitted into an effective new role: flak protection for the carriers. Still, the American victory was not assured. The tenacity of the Japanese defense everywhere, prolonged operations, and exhausted units, the distance of the American lines of communication naturally lengthened as the drives of Nimitz and MacArthur proceeded. That, in turn, increased supply and maintenance demands astronomically. Fuel, ammunition, aircraft, spares, food, construction materials, bulldozers, trucks, jeeps, tanks, landing craft, floating docks. All of this was needed in huge quantities at a time when the US was also feeding Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion, the liberation of France, and the pending invasion of Germany. Like military intelligence, logistics was a critical area fully valued by the United States in the war and consistently undervalued by the Japanese. In Washington, Admiral Ernie King, the chief of naval operations, constantly warned that the problem of distribution threatened at all times to unhinge the war effort. He wrote, "The problem of distribution became one of primary importance. Motion, not size, became the most important factor in the war. Distribution was now more important than production. It didn't matter how much stuff you produced if you couldn't get that stuff to the units at the tip of the spear." By February 1944, the Navy had so many carriers that it could twin an assault on the Marshall Islands with a 12-carrier diversionary operation against Truk and the Carolines. That single diversionary attack on Truk eliminated at a stroke 10% of Japan's dwindling cargo and tanker shipping, which made trade and communication within the Japanese empire and between its resource areas and strong points all but impossible. Well, Nimitz hit the Marianas in June of 1944. The distances now, as they got closer and closer to the Japanese home islands, were vast. Saipan, for example, was 1,000 miles from Eniwetok. which was the closest operating base in the Marshalls, and 3,400 miles from Pearl Harbor. And yet Saipan was just 1,300 miles from Tokyo, which made it much easier for Japan to defend because it was closer than the US to that fighting front. So the US weighs in with 600 ships, 2,000 aircraft, and 300,000 Marine and Army troops. One of the great battles of the war, coinciding with D-Day in France. Well, Saipan falls after bitter fighting in July, Guam in August of 1944. And then come the battles at Leyte Gulf, Manila, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Okinawa was vital because its capture severed Japanese communications with the Southwest Pacific and severely hampered Japanese communications with that vast army they had in China. It would also be a base for a US assault on Japan. So for this reason, the Japanese put 120,000 troops with guns and armor on the island and set off an 82-day battle until the US took the island after just absolutely brutal fighting in June of 1945. The Pacific War ultimately was won by the aircraft carrier. Without carriers, the US would still have been stuck in the Solomon Islands in 1945. Because without carriers, the US simply could not have coped with the huge distances in the Pacific. The carriers brought tactical and strategic air power finally into range. They conquered geography, and geography had been Japan's only salvation in the face of growing American power. Once carriers had conquered bases close to Japan, like Tinian and Okinawa, land-based air patrols could escalate the wars to unimagined levels of violence and destruction. In the 5 months between April and August 1945, General Curtis LeMay's 21st Bomber Command shattered Japan's major cities with a B-29 Superfortress. Japan's air defenses by then were so attrited by shortages that the bombers could fly in at 7,000 feet to release their bomb loads. Incredibly, Japanese fighters intercepted only 50 of 27,000 American sorties. So thin were the ranks of Japanese fighters by that point. In 66 Japanese cities, 40% of the built-up area was destroyed. 8 million refugees were created. Japanese worker absenteeism rose to 50%. Aluminum production in Japan fell to 9% of its wartime peak. Steel production to 15%. And then, of course, there was the atomic bomb. Only America could spare the resources to invent it. Secret cities at Oak Ridge, Hanford, and Los Alamos, and a Manhattan Project that employed 130,000 people and cost $2 billion, which is about $25 billion today. The extreme difficulty of the project is glimpsed in the fact that even with full government backing, an all-star team of scientists, and no interruptions from bombing or sabotage, a nuclear device was not ready until July 1945, too late for the war with Germany for which the bomb had been intended. A single atom bomb dropped on Hiroshima on August 6 destroyed half the city and killed 66,000 people. The bomb dropped on Nagasaki on August 9th, destroyed a quarter of the buildings and killed 40,000 people. So the war in the Pacific was the ultimate expression of the strategic indirect approach. The US principally targeted Japanese supply and communications and steadily lopped off Japan's overseas territories, sea frontiers, and foreign trade. That said, we must also note the mix of strategic indirectness and tactical directness. America's indirect focus on the ulterior object of Tokyo was accompanied by ferocious infantry assaults on the key intermediate island groups. This mix of direct and indirect approaches helped demoralize the Japanese, who had premised Pearl Harbor, and indeed their entire strategy in the war, on their presumption of US weakness, decadence, and even cowardice. Whereas the US enjoyed a production miracle during the war, the Japanese suffered the opposite. Japanese GDP stagnated between 1941 and 1945. Coal, vital for the production of everything in Japan, simply couldn't be shipped in sufficient quantities because of naval and air attacks and the steady destruction of Japanese shipping. Well before the atom bombs were dropped, the Japanese wartime economy had been destroyed. 3 million casualties, 80% of Japanese shipping, 35% of Japanese industrial machinery, 25% of their buildings, 25% of their national wealth, just destroyed by the constant attacks of the Americans. US air power delivered most of this damage, but it was brought into range by the Navy, the Marines, and the Army divisions in the Pacific. US sea power confirmed freedom of movement and choice of objective, as well as choice of approach and the element of surprise. In the Pacific War, the US achieved what would have been impossible for any other military in that conflict. They took tactical and strategic air power and moved it within range of the Japanese homeland. They took the Army and the Marines, which had loaded themselves with so many vehicles to mechanize, thus making themselves so mobile that they couldn't move, and they moved them using quantities of shipping that would have been beyond the ability of any other great power. This was the American way of war in a nutshell. As General Cummings says in Norman Mailer's great novel, The Naked and the Dead, the historical significance of this war will be that the vast potential of America was made kinetic. Thanks very much, and I'm going to throw you back to Jeff, and I guess I'll wait any questions. If we can get questions, I'm not sure, as we have some audio difficulties between me and the home base. Hello?
Check the chat. There's some questions for you.
Oh, yeah. Okay. As for Yamamoto, you know, he was he knew America very well, and he was aware of America's tremendous strengths, but and so that's why he devised this Pearl Harbor stratagem, knowing that you know, if Japan went toe to toe with the United States, it would lose in an all-out war. So he was looking for a gambit that would kind of you know, demoralize the U.S. and make it seem like it was impossible to you know, recover and fight a war across this big oceanic space. So, but he was always pessimistic. I mean, it was not like Yamamoto ever believed that had high hopes for this strategy. He was just basically saying of the strategies available to a power like Japan against a power like the United States, this probably offers the best hope for success. As for Kimmel and Short, they were made scapegoats for the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, as I suppose they should have been. There's just the lack of attention to warnings and the lack of attention to the sharpening diplomatic tensions between the United States and Japan, the lack of preparedness, the lack of precautions taken, the fact that aircraft were parked wing to wing as if there was no threat of Japanese attack. Yes, it would be far-fetched to imagine that the Japanese carriers could get within range of Pearl Harbor undetected. But this is why we have generals and admirals in command of these important posts to anticipate these kind of things and to take the countermeasures. So their careers which had begun during World War I, and they had risen up through the ranks, didn't really survive this check after and the disgrace of the Japanese successful sneak attack on Pearl Harbor. I didn't see the new Midway movie. I only saw the one in the 70s with Henry Fonda and everybody else that was in it. So I haven't seen the new one. Didn't do well on Rotten Tomatoes. I know that. I don't see any other questions. I see. There's more up here. Let me see. How significant was America First? I'm not sure. I mean, it was. I think the Japanese calculations were based obviously on people like Lindbergh and America First, but just a general strain of isolationism in U.S. politics after World War I, when there was a feeling that 150,000 casualties, vast amount of national treasure spent on the war to separate these these European powers and create peace in Europe, and in fact, within a generation, they're kind of sliding back into war, and all the old tensions are rekindled. And at the same time, Japan has taken advantage of the respite to expand its influence over China and contest American wishes there. So, there's just a sense that this is, the Japanese, I think, correctly read that the American mood was isolationist, as you can see by things like the Neutrality Acts passed in the 1930s, so that presidents could not prop up potential allied powers without the express approval of an increasingly skeptical and isolationist Congress. So the Japanese were basing this on hard science. What they weren't factoring was the intangible, the chief intangible, which was what would be the impact on the American mood and the American spirit if the Japanese struck a place like Pearl Harbor, killing Americans, destroying American equipment, and giving America a huge black eye. How would the Americans react? And I think it was Yamamoto's calculation that they would be demoralized and they would be weakened by the blow. Whereas in reality, the Americans got their back up and came in stronger than before and sort of cast isolation. Somebody says, point me in the direction of your research. I would say just, you know, you can go to my website, geoffreywawro.com, or just Google me, and the website will come up on the first page. Or go to Amazon. My 6 books are all there. Right now, I'm starting a new book about Vietnam, and I'm just getting started. I've been researching it for a couple of summers, and I'm starting to work on it now. Was Herman Wouk's depiction of the battle? I don't know. I haven't read that, so I don't know how accurate it was. But you know, I was just watching. You know, there's this series that I participated in for the Netflix series Greatest Events of World War II in Color, and it just was released late in 2019. So I've just started going through it recently. And the episode on Midway is interesting because it really kind of talks much more about the kind of bold counter moves of Nimitz, and much less about the intelligence coup that allowed us to, you know, sort of detect the Japanese moves in advance and move to intercept them. So there's in terms of Midway, still seems to be, we don't seem to give full enough credit to the intelligence gathering that allowed us to anticipate the Japanese move. All that said, however, that even with the intelligence, it still was quite amazing. And plus, often intelligence was wrong. So, you know, to sort of say that we knew everything, well, we knew that this might happen, but, you know, it could have been, the intelligence could have been bad, and we could have been badly embarrassed. So it's just taken all together, it's still just an absolutely tremendous victory, as I say in the talk, on par with Trafalgar or Tsushima. As for, oh yeah, so we're going to sign off after this. MacArthur's campaign was essentially redundant given the effect of Nimitz island hopping. You know, that's still a subject of great debate, and it's often used as yet another example of MacArthur's, you know, braggadocio, you know, that he needed to be an important piece of this war, and he needed to be given an important mission. There's no question that he was applying additional pressure on Japan. But yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, there were a dozen army divisions in use in the Pacific theater, and MacArthur had a lot of them, and he was pushing up through New Guinea and then into the Philippines and putting, you know, great pressure on the Japanese. There were some battles, highly controversial battles like Peleliu, that I regard, and most historians regard, as being absolutely unnecessary. That one was conducted by the Marine Corps, where you would hit an island that you didn't really need, and you would absorb heavy casualties needlessly. And MacArthur committed some of these sins as well. But you know, we're all wise after the fact. These were fast-moving battles, and they were trying to attrite Japanese power and trying to get the key position. So, you know, I think that there was a great sort of synergy between the Central Pacific Drive and MacArthur's island hopping of his own. So I thank everyone for listening today and watching, and I hope it was helpful in some way. And I can't communicate, but with the Nimitz, with the history of the Museum of World War II in the Pacific in Fredericksburg. But I'm going to throw it back to them now, to Jeff. And thanks, everyone.